Does slavery still exist in the United States of America? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Several states have voted to remove the last vestiges of slavery from their legislation with the goal of revamping the U.S. Constitution. Slavery and involuntary servitude are prohibited on the national level, but forced labor is still allowed in many state prisons. Now that is slowly changing as well. CGTN's Hendrik Sebrandi has this report.
As Election Day results rolled in, it took a while for the man who helped spearhead ballot measures in 5 U.S. states to realize what he and others had accomplished.
It really didn't sink in at first. You know, I was just going through the processes.
Max Parthes heads the Abolish Slavery National Network.
Peace and welcome to Abolition Today.
It hit him when he recorded his weekly radio show.
It's just so unbelievable. The 2022 journey for slavery abolition has reached its amazing conclusion.
Voters in 4 of the 5 states overwhelmingly said slavery and involuntary servitude should be prohibited even as punishment for crime. The so-called exclusion clause of the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution outlawing slavery still permits forced labor in prisons.
For instance, you may have a prison guard who decides that if a person doesn't want to work, they're going to put them in the hole for 30 days. Well, that's now illegal. And until we start to hold people accountable for that, they're going to continue to do it.
This has been going on for 157 years. And most people don't even know that it exists.
Curtis Davis did countless jobs in a Louisiana prison while serving a sentence for second-degree murder. His conviction was eventually overturned. For him, saying no to work was not an option.
For me, it's about a dignity issue, about treating people with human decency. I knew it was wrong because it's inhumane.
His state, because of a dispute over wording, was the only one of the 5 not to approve a slavery measure during this election. 8 U.S. states, including Colorado, have outlawed slavery in its entirety, but that doesn't mean forced labor will stop in all these places right away. It will be up to courts, Parthes says, to stop the practice of coercing prisoners to work under threat of sanctions or loss of privileges, a reality that's ongoing.
It's okay to have laws and constitutional amendments, but without a public opinion and a government willing to enforce those laws, they're a mockery.
Slavery will be on the ballot in more states in coming years. The ultimate goal of abolitionists is a new federal amendment that bans slavery in whatever form for good.
It's going to be a process
that's now achieved new momentum.
I never really thought we would even get this far.
Hendrik Sebrandi, CGTN, Denver.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Jacquie Luqman is the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Also in the U.S. Capitol is Joseph Williams. He is a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. And from New York, we're joined by Bianca Tylek. She is the founder and executive director of Worth Rises. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Bianca, let me start with you. You and your organization have been you've been advocating for the complete abolition of slavery in the United States. But you talk to most people and they say, well, look, there is the 13th Amendment, and that's what the 13th Amendment did. It got rid of slavery in the country. But there is an exception, and that exception is known as the slavery loophole. So break that down for us. Can you explain that to us and how it affects people who are in prison?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So the 13th Amendment, as we all know, we all learned in high school, right, or even earlier, that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But the reality is that it never actually quite did that because of the exception clause. In fact, we polled Americans and we found that 88% of Americans do not know that this exception clause exists. And so, you know, a lot of our work has been first focused on that educational point, understanding that there is an exception. How this exception got into our 13th Amendment is so important. And it started with the fact that in 1865, when the 13th Amendment was passed, there was a negotiation with the southern states that had slavery to keep this clause in the 13th Amendment. And it was used after the passage of the 13th Amendment to essentially re-enslave who were formerly freed, enslaved Black people through the use of what were called Black codes or laws that only applied to Black people and usually criminalized things like vagrancy. It put people back into the system, and as soon as they could be labeled criminal or accused and convicted of a crime, no matter how small, they could be re-enslaved, sometimes on the very same plantations. And that same process has basically existed all the way until today, where we're talking about people who are incarcerated still being subject to this particular exception clause. And so our work is to finally be able to say that slavery is always wrong. Slavery is wrong in every single circumstance for all people. And it's a basic human right for us to be protected from slavery.
So as you say, Bianca, I mean, that was an amendment that was passed in 1865, and a provision in there, that exception in there, is being used in 2023.
Yes, and consistently. In fact, there have been many court cases that have used the 13th Amendment exception clause to protect essentially the involuntary servitude of people who are incarcerated. Incarcerated people have time and time again tried to go to the courts and asked for protections, labor protections, employment protections under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, and yet been denied that because of the exception in the 13th Amendment. And what that looks like inside, as we heard from Max Parthas, is it looks like people who are incarcerated being put into solitary confinement for 23 hours a day because they refuse to work. It looks like them being denied contact with their families, phone calls and visits because they refuse to work or do the specific job that they're inclined for. It means people who are incarcerated can work for 25 straight years without a day off, or even the ability to call and ask to be off for a sick day. It means that people who are incarcerated are paid on average 14 cents an hour. And so these, the actual manifestations of that exception clause are very real.
Joseph Williams, 4 out of 5 states are removing the slavery loophole from their state constitutions. That will bring it to 7 states in total out of the 50 states. Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont decided for that change in the 2022 election, but Louisiana voted against it. Why has this not gained more traction nationally? Hi, Joseph, can you hear me? Okay, I don't think Joseph's with us right now.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I hear you now.
Did you hear my question, Joseph?
I did indeed.
Okay, go ahead.
They're workforce, basically. They're away from society. People can't see them. They don't have rights. They don't have a voice to complain. They don't have representation for all intents and purposes in the halls of power. So it's very easy to overlook this particular population. Louisiana is among the more egregious offenders of this particular form of slavery. They don't really have a system where prisoners can protect themselves, and polite society, as it's sometimes called, is considered. They consider if you're in prison, you did something wrong, you deserve to be there, and this is just a measure of punishment that's exacted for you to pay for your crime. When in reality, it's a human rights violation, and it does nothing to prepare the incarcerated for returning to society. Ostensibly, these jobs are to give the incarcerated some skills so they can earn some money on the inside and maybe be a productive citizen upon their release. But time and time again, we found countless examples where people are paid nothing at all or paid pennies on the hour, which is not even close to something like a living wage, and which is closer to involuntary servitude than it is actually earning something. These jobs are menial, they don't acquire skills, and in large part, they're responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the very prisons that are detaining them.
Jacquie, looking at what prisoners are paid for their work when they are in prison, I was looking at some figures from the ACLU. The ACLU has released a report which tells us that there are 800,000 imprisoned people working in U.S. prisons. Most prison jobs pay an average of 13 to 52 cents an hour. That's, of course, pennies compared to the $7.25 hourly rate, which is itself very, very low. Then looking at some other figures here, the ACLU tells us that incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion in goods and $9 billion in services. and that 65% of those in prison are actually forced to work. I mean, how can that be justified or allowed? I mean, do these prisoners have no access to United States law? I mean, even the wage they paid is a violation of law.
Well, when the enslavement and oppression of a group of people is codified into United States law, then those people who are enslaved don't have access to anything other than the punishment that that law says that they deserve. And that's what the exception clause of the 13th Amendment does. It codifies the exploitation and oppression of a specific group of people. And when we look at the history of the 13th Amendment and we go forward to today, we cannot help but see the racialized aspect of prison slave labor and the class aspect of prison slave labor, because just as the situation was true when the exception clause was agreed to in the 13th Amendment, it was used to perpetuate mass incarceration of newly freed, formerly enslaved people. The same clause is used to feed mass incarceration of mostly Black people, Latinx people who are mostly poor. So this is really a stark and very crystal clear example of the exploitative nature of capitalism and how capitalism has to have a class of exploited people at the bottom in order for it to continue to reap its obscene profits for a very few, and at the same time is able to use the law to allow people to feel good about not caring that those people are being marginalized, because after all, they're so-called criminals, so this is the punishment and they deserve it.
Brian Becker, you know, I was saying a moment ago that the prisoners are receiving between 13 and 52 cents an hour for their labor, but it's actually worse than that. In many states, they don't get paid at all, and among those states are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. And all these states, of course, have a history of slavery. How does this happen in a country which often refers to itself as the leader of the free world, as a bastion of freedom, democracy, liberty?
Yeah, that's one of the mythologies promoted by the United States, that it is this ultimate bastion of freedom and democracy. When it was a system built on slave labor, the elites in America became rich based on the unpaid labor of those who had been kidnapped and enslaved. Right now, there are, the United States is 4% of the world's population. 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the world is in a United States prison. That's 2.1 million people. These people are the source of great, great profits. In the case of Florida, for instance, and we have to look at this in some historical perspective, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, the Civil War amendments, the white elites in Florida realized that white voters would be a minority, and that they resorted to the incarceration of Black people in untold numbers, and as one of your other guests mentioned, creating laws like the Black codes that only applied to Black people, so that they could retain a position of white supremacy and a system of white supremacy and a profit system based on white supremacy by using the enslavement now under a new form by imprisoning those who had been formerly their property. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment eventually, and very quickly after the defeat of Reconstruction by 1876, becomes something of a mockery. By the way, the state of Mississippi only ratified the 13th Amendment, as egregious as it is, in 1995. It took them another 130 years. We have a situation in the United States where felons are still, in essence, prevented from voting. Again, in the state of Florida in 2018, as a result of this mass incarceration of Black people, and especially Black men in Florida, millions of Black men lost the right to vote. It wasn't simply being enslaved in prison, but you lost the right to vote, the right to participate in democracy when you got out. And now Florida Governor DeSantis has deprived 775,000 former felons of the right to vote through these new prohibitive restrictions and laws that have been passed, even though voters voted in a referendum to restore voting rights for felons. So this is a comprehensive system of slavery, of profit, and of the maintenance of a system of white supremacy.
Bianca, the Ella Baker Center, which is based in California, it estimates that 1/3 of households with a family member in prison go into debt to cover the cost of just telephone calls. So it doesn't just affect the prisoners, it affects their families as well. How big is that impact?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really great point. So people who are incarcerated, oftentimes people think they have everything provided for them. They don't. In fact, they have very little provided for them. And there is a great cost that comes with being incarcerated. And because of the wages that are paid to people inside, as you mentioned, sometimes nothing, other times a few cents an hour, those costs really end up becoming borne by their families, by their loved ones. And so those are the cost of calls, the cost of commissary, basic hygiene needs, food, supplements, medical costs. Those are actually borne by, in many cases, family members. And as was mentioned by one of the guests, disproportionately Black and brown family members, and disproportionately women. 87% of those that are carrying those costs are women who are supporting. And so we say this is not just a criminal justice issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. It's a gender justice issue. And so that impact is huge. It's huge on children who are left behind. I always say, when you steal wages from somebody who's incarcerated, you're not just stealing the wages from them. You're stealing wages from the children that they left behind that they cannot support, who do not deserve that. And you're also stealing from the victims. Many victims have a right to restitution. And that restitution cannot be paid when you are earning a few cents an hour. And so people come out not just with the debt of the cost of actual incarceration, but also with the cost of restitution that they haven't been able to pay to their victims. So the real impact on the community is extensive of the fact that we are stealing from those who are laboring long and consistent hours inside.
Joseph Williams, I want to talk a little bit more about the disproportionate number of people, brown and black people, who are in the prison system. The NAACP released a fact sheet on the impact of incarceration in the United States. And as Brian Becker told us a moment ago, 1 in 4 prisoners in the world are in United States prisons. But this NAACP report, among the more significant figures, African Americans and Hispanics make up 32% of the United States population, but 56% of the prison population in the United States. Does this point to the fact that the justice system, the law enforcement system, is basically racist?
It's hard to deny that there's a disproportionate impact, and racism absolutely exists in the system. As a matter of fact, there are many people who would argue that it was set up basically to affect black and brown people, as we've been discussing, and mostly the poor. It's no accident that this is the case. And we had a boom in the 70s and the 80s of incarceration, particularly in the 80s, where the 3 strikes laws became popular and people stayed in for a lot longer time. And you have generations of poverty. And we know that there's a connection between poverty and crime. Not every poor person commits a crime, but you're more likely to be incarcerated if you come from a background where you didn't have a lot of means, where there wasn't a stable home. Study after study has proven that that is a connection. So we're creating generations of poor people, and the prison system is pretty much a stable part of that. We also have a lot of studies that have shown that kids in high school and in elementary school even are part of what's known as the school to prison pipeline, where you have kids who are disciplined and they get on a track and they end up being criminalized for misbehavior in school. And that's got a racialized component to it. So it's hard to argue against the fact that the U.S. prison system, the so-called criminal justice system, has a very stark racial disparity in it, and racism runs all the way back through its founding. So when you consider that history, it's no wonder that inmates are being abused. It's no wonder that people are profiting off of them, not just the state for having people conduct maintenance like along highways or in prisons or charging them for the basic necessities, but major corporations that are using prisoners for telecom, that are using them to create and build different manufacturing items. It's a system that's kind of, if you want reform, you probably pretty much have to start top to bottom in order to make a substantive change here.
Jacquie, tell us more about the Black Codes and how it feeds into the kind of slavery that we're seeing in the United States today. The Black Codes were the predecessor to the Jim Crow laws, which governed the behavior of free and freed people, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And they criminalized behavior and actions that were actually not criminal before, like being homeless, like not having a job, like quote unquote loitering. These were things that were not crimes in this country before the end of enslavement and until the Black Codes were implemented. And they were implemented precisely to create a slave labor workforce of formerly enslaved people, to literally re-enslave the population of free and forced labor that the South basically lost when they lost the Civil War. So in the way that the Constitution was shaped with this deal that was made with the losing part, the losing end of the war, it certainly does give credence to the idea that the South lost the battle, but maybe they did win the war because they have certainly been successful in shaping the laws and even the attitudes of people in this country toward crime in general and toward Black people connected with crime, to the point where people really don't care what happens to people who are in jails and prisons, because Blackness is so tightly conferred with criminality, and so many people in this country really do believe, well, good riddance to those criminals, they're off the streets and they deserve what they get. So today, yes, there are still laws on the books in states all over the country that makes loitering illegal. There are still vagrancy laws on the books all across this country. Homelessness itself may not be illegal, but people who are homeless are arrested under those other laws, or, you know, for being a public nuisance or something like that. So what we have is making the results of societal inadequacy to meet people's needs a crime, so that people can stuff the prisons for another generation of free and forced labor of more Black and brown people, just like the Black Codes did.
Brian Becker, incarcerating people is, of course, also a big business. President Biden did sign an executive order in 2021 in which he ended the federal for-profit prisons, but there are still, of course, profit prisons in many of the states under state control. According to the Sentencing Project, 8% of the total prison population in the United States is held in private for-profit prisons. These corporations that own these prisons are also major donors to members of Congress here in Washington, D.C. And how does this feature into the slave business?
Well, it's very, very important. It's a real phenomena that's grown up in the last few decades. As the Sentencing Project pointed out, 8%, about 100,000 human beings are in for-profit prisons, meaning the prisons and the judges and the prosecutors close by are all incentivized to put people in these prisons. They're a source of employment and they're a source of profit. You know, between the U.S. Constitution was signed in 1787. In the next 200 years, over 200 years, the U.S. reached the 1 million mark in terms of the number of people incarcerated. That would be 1987. In the next 15 years, we went to the next million. That was the surge of mass incarceration. Another million people put into prison between the mid-1980s and the early 2000s. At the same time, the American industrial heartland, places where people could get decent jobs, industrial jobs, were being hollowed out as corporate America overseas and offshore jobs. So there was a redundant population no longer necessary for industrial labor. And so the U.S. Government, and Joe Biden was a principal architect of this in the 1994 so-called Criminal Justice Reform Act, which he considered to be his most prideful achievement as a senator. That was the way the laws were reconstructed in America that made mass incarceration and a particularly odious, racist sort of double standard for sentencing based on the certain kind of crimes that were being committed, such that Black America, and especially young Black people, were being unduly targeted on a mass basis. That's how we arrived at this over sort of population in the prisons that then allowed private prisons to become a necessity. So the federal prisons, the state prisons, the county prisons were overflowing with human bodies, and then private capitalists said, well, look, we're here to help. We can help your overcrowding problem, but of course it's a great source of profit. This is an evil system, and again, based fundamentally on slavery.
Bianca, there are plans to get more states to remove that slavery loophole from their constitutions, and that will happen in the 2024 election. That's when that effort will be made. But there's a lot that needs to be done in the meantime, isn't there?
Absolutely. So we've been leading a campaign actually at the federal level. So there are campaigns both at the state level and at the federal level to rid our Constitution, our federal Constitution, our U.S. Constitution, as well as our state constitutions, of this exception clause. So it exists, as we've been talking about, in the 13th Amendment, but because of the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the sort of declaration of all these other states, many states also have this language in their state constitutions. So where the federal government hasn't acted, there are organizers, advocates that are working at the state level to at least get their states to take this action. As you mentioned, Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, Vermont took action this year, and previous to this year, Colorado, Utah, Nebraska, and Rhode Island had all taken action. And so now we're up to 8 states that have eliminated this exception clause. And we're working at the federal level to move the abolition amendment and encourage people to go to endtheexception.com to see what those efforts look like.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.